Professor Brandon, and you just talk about the bilingual speakers in English and Chinese, and you say that the singulate activation for both language processing is similar. So I was wondering, mm, is our brain language specific or not?
Yes, it's a very good question. We think that just to correct you, the studies that show overlapping activation for Chinese and English come from studies of bilingual speakers, balanced bilingual speakers. So, for example, I did work in the 90s in Singapore with many young students at NUS who could speak both English and Putonghua fluently. And when we did experiments with those individuals, we found very little difference in the activation pattern for the task presented in Chinese and the task presented in English. That's for balanced bilinguals. In the case of a monolingual speaker who doesn't have any knowledge of the other language, we do find more specialization. So it seems that for a monolingual Chinese speaker, the evidence, at least if we look at monolingual speakers of Putonghua who come from, say, Beijing, studies done some 10 or 20 years ago, it seems that the activation for Chinese only in lexical decision engages the right hemisphere more so than in the case of an English native speaker who lives in London on a lexical decision task with English. But there's a number of problems with that between subjects design. The problem is, first of all, that the group of participants in Beijing and the group of participants in London will be different on many other aspects, not just the language they speak. So more activation in the right hemisphere compared to the left could reflect other factors not to do with the language itself. I think on balance, neurolinguists believe that the type of language, even when they are very different, such as Chinese and English, doesn't make a lot of difference to the neurobiology of language. So no matter what the type of language, the processing in the brain for that language seems to recruit very similar areas. There are some differences which are thought to be a consequence of unique features of the language, such as possibly tone in the case of Chinese and the visual characteristics of Chinese characters for Chinese speakers. But on balance, the evidence would suggest very few differences between languages in cognitive neurolinguistics.
Can it be cited as the evidence for not for Chomsky's universalities of language?
Well, Chomsky's view was that there are surface structures which may differ, but these are not interesting to language or linguistics. That is, any surface features are irrelevant to understanding the substance of language as a communication device. So if we take the visual features of the Chinese script compared to the visual features of the English script, alphabetic script, those would be considered superficial or surface differences. And for Chomsky, that would be irrelevant. It's not even a question to ask, because for understanding language at a deeper level, those surface features are irrelevant. So if you find a difference between Chinese characters and English words, for Chomsky that would be no big deal. But let's take tone, which is a deeper structure in Chinese. Tone actually marks the meaning of words in Chinese and does not in English generally. So that is a real difference at the linguistic level. And for Chomsky, that would be a closer distinction to challenge the universal idea of language across types of language. But tone doesn't have a grammatical function, and what Chomsky's universal grammar proposes is that the underlying grammatical structure is the same across languages. Tone only changes the lexical semantic characteristics of the language. So once again, Chomsky would say, no big deal, not relevant.
So, even when we are talking about the tone and the cite it as evidence for non-Chomsky's universality, they are contradictory.
It's not that there are contradictory findings. I think more central to your question is what's the big deal? So if there is a language device, if it's universal, a question that comes to mind is what value would neuroscience make to that question? For Chomsky, I think the value would be very limited unless we can devise a way of abstracting the primitives of language, the basic grammatical structure, universal grammar, at a neural level. But I very much doubt Chomsky would either believe that or even advocate trying to find it.
It seems that we wanted to figure out the phenomenon from different perspectives in different disciplines.
I think linguists do look at this question differently. Linguists believe that Chomsky, pretty much they all believe Chomsky's right. So psychologists don't. But psychologists ask a different set of questions. Neurologists ask a different set of questions. Neuroscience isn't necessarily concerned with the universal grammar. Neurobiology of language should be concerned with that question, but as yet there is no real paradigm or method that can distinguish this question usefully. One exception to that would be the distinction between syntactical judgment and meaning judgment, so-called N400, where we get differences with ERP according to whether the task refers to making grammatical judgment or a meaning judgment to the sentence that's presented. And there is some evidence that at least the time course of semantic and syntactic judgment is different. But again, there is contradictory evidence to suggest that the two are interactive. For Chomsky, it's important that those two systems are independent. But how far neuroscience can address that question is unclear. If anything, the data from fMRI suggests that the processing of a sentence is complicated. It involves memory, attention, many other aspects of cognitive processing. It's not simply a universal grammar task or test of universal grammar. And furthermore, by watching the brain in real time, we see that syntax and meaning interact. So isolating those processes becomes, in some way, a non-question for the neuroscientists, but of course for Chomskyans, it's still a critical question.
So, in our neurological experiments, and because the notal functions are overlapping, especially for the activated area, so it's very difficult for us to subtract it from the whole part.
Yes, I think on balance we have to say that the attempt to distinguish a process as complicated as grammar or syntax from a process as complicated as semantics, meaning, is ultimately flawed.
Thank you.